My name is Adrian Wu. I'm a senior programs manager here at GTI and the host of our soft power and cultural policy podcast, Taiwan Salon. So thank you so much for joining us today for this event. Before we start, I'd just like to give a little bit of an introduction of GTI and our work, just in case anyone is unfamiliar with what we do. So we're a 501c3 think tank dedicated to insightful, cutting-edge, and inclusive research on policy issues regarding Taiwan and the world. Our mission is to enhance the relationship between Taiwan and other countries, especially the United States, through policy research and programs that promote better public understanding about Taiwan and its people. And we do that through a number of programs, including our Global Taiwan Brief, which is published bi-weekly, podcasts, our annual symposium, as well as our public seminars, which, of course, this is one of them. I would also like to thank the staff and the interns for making this event possible, as well as the board and our advisors for their support in our programs. So the event today is called Taiwan's Great Recall: Elections and the Impact on Taiwan's Future Politics. So we're joined by an all-star cast here today. The run of show will go from Bo, Nathan, and Shelley. So our panelists include Dr. Nathan Batto from Academia Sinica, Dr. Shelley Rigger from Davidson College, and Bo Teddards, who is currently an independent analyst, but formerly of the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. And of course, the event is moderated by myself. So yeah, I think we can basically just jump into it. I know that everyone is really excited to hear all of the presentations. So Bo, would you like to take it away?
Yeah, thank you, Adrian, and thanks to GTI for holding this event. People really haven't been paying enough attention to the recalls, as far as I can tell. And so the more we can get out there of information to help people understand what's going on, the better. So let me start with one point, just as sort of a distant historical background as a baseline for everyone, that the idea of recalls was introduced to Taiwan by the KMT. It comes directly from Sun Yat-sen's three principles of the people, and it was clearly enshrined in the 1947 Constitution. And the second point I want to make is that for people for whom the overriding concern with Taiwan is its level of defense preparedness, which might include some people in the audience, I think you should be definitely applauding the recalls, because they will make the Legislative Yuan at least somewhat more amenable to both raising defense budgets and passing necessary defense reforms. You know this is true because the KMT is not even trying to make the counterargument. They never say that the recalls are slowing down or damaging any of these defense preparedness measures, or that the failure of recall would somehow speed them up. Instead, they're making totally different arguments against the recalls, which I'm going to come back to in a minute, and I think we'll spend most of our time today discussing. Now, I just use the term amenable on purpose. There are, in fact, three mechanisms by which the recalls might bring about a more amenable legislative yuan. The most straightforward one is that the DPP might possibly be able to flip enough seats to gain a majority outright. I'm not sure how likely that is. Maybe Nathan knows. But obviously, a DPP majority would be more amenable to supporting Taiwan's defense. The second mechanism is more subtle, but it's very interesting. I think the recalls are likely to somehow change the composition of the KMT caucus by replacing some of its members. That is, the original member might lose their seat, but the KMT might win it back in the by-election with a different member. On average, I believe these new members are likely to be less extreme and more moderate, because that is, in fact, what the electorate is demanding. And if the recall succeeded in the first round, that means the electorate has demanded it quite clearly. But again, it's hard to predict how large this effect will be, but the direction of the change should be clear towards greater amenability. To take one very obvious example, the most obvious example, if legislator Fu Kunqi, who is so controversial even within the KMT, if he were to lose his seat and be replaced by just a run-of-the-mill KMT member, that should improve matters. That should improve the overall tenor of the caucus. If this happens several times, I think that definitely the tenor of the caucus would shift. So that's mechanism number two. The third mechanism is that the recalls, simply by this clear demonstration of a groundswell of public anger about what the Legislative Yuan has been doing for the past year, might put the fear of God into some KMT members, and indeed some TPP members, even though they're not directly involved in the recall. In other words, they might feel they need to tack towards the center, to shift their positions in order to survive future elections. And in fact, I think this effect is already happening. I hope no one thinks it's a coincidence that the KMT decided to unfreeze most of the defense budget and to pass the special budget, including the defense measures, in the immediate run-up to the recall votes. I think it's definitely a result of the popular pressure that they're feeling. And of course, all three of these mechanisms operate simultaneously. So since they all push in the same direction, as far as I can see, I hope some combination of these three things will actually deliver a more amenable legislative yuan. Now I want to turn to the KMT arguments. Basically, they've been trying to frame the recalls as harmful to Taiwan's democracy. Some of the arguments are awfully strident. I mean, that the recalls are a step to authoritarianism, that it's more communist than the communists and more fascist than the fascists. That's a quote. A much more sophisticated version of this is the idea that recalls are somehow inherently destabilizing, that one should, the will of the voters is to be expressed at elections, at regular elections, and not in between. That the recalls somehow are overturning or challenging the will of the voters from the election. That's a more sophisticated argument that's worth paying a bit more attention to. But of course, any country that adopts recalls at all, including the ROC, by definition allows the possibility that voters sometimes may want to second guess or have second thoughts themselves about who they elected last time. These are the rules of the game in Taiwan. There's an interesting quote from former President Ma Ying-jeou about recalls once, where he said clearly that the recall is something that we use whenever the voters lose confidence in their members. It's like a constituent vote of no confidence on a member, is what he was saying. That's a good point. However, any political or democratic mechanism, even if it's however well designed it might be, could be misused. So then we have to ask the next question is, are the recalls in fact being misused at this time? And for the background, for people who haven't been following Taiwan as closely, Taiwan's constitutional order provides for the possibility of divided government. It will happen from time to time, just as it does in the United States and France and many other democracies. And so then you have to look at what mechanisms exist to deal with such situations, to resolve disputes between the branches. So we've had, tremendous disputes between the executive and legislative branch. What are the mechanisms available to resolve them? In the United States, there are three main ones. The first are midterm elections, that the voters every 2 years have a chance to refresh the composition of Congress. Second is the strong veto power of the president. It requires a 2/3 majority to override. And third is the Supreme Court, which can arbitrate disputes by deciding whether either the executive or the legislative branch has exceeded their powers. So in France, they also have the additional idea that the president can dissolve parliament and call for fresh elections altogether, which is, in my opinion, even a more drastic move than a recall, but that's part of the system in France. In Taiwan, we don't have midterms normally. We don't have the power of dissolving parliament from the president, and the veto power is so weak that it almost doesn't exist. So we're left with just the Constitutional Court as the primary mechanism to deal with disputes. And last year, the court started to move and ruled one batch of KMT sponsored bills to be mostly unconstitutional. But then the legislative majority moved to directly attack the Constitutional Court and paralyze it. And it is, in fact, basically paralyzed now. And more than anything, that action turned what should have been an ordinary divided government scenario into more like a constitutional crisis. Unfortunately for Taiwan, there's one additional mechanism that neither the US nor France has, is that the citizens can take matters into their own hands to do the recall of members of parliament. Not an easy mechanism to use, requires citizens to do a lot of work, but they have done it. It's really quite a fabulous amount of effort done by many citizens across the country. And by self-organizing in this way, they have managed to create a kind of midterm election, giving almost half the electorate, or about half, Nathan may know the exact number, a chance to weigh in on the excesses of the Legislative Yuan and the situation. And while the KMT and even ironically the CCP have said we should respect the will of the voters from last year, the question is, what if the legislators, either individually or collectively, are not following the mandate that they were given? And in my view, it's quite clear that both the KMT and the TPP have exceeded their mandates. Note that voters did not give the KMT an actual majority, but only a slightly larger plurality than the DPPs. On a more micro level, even the KMT voters did not elect Fu Kunqi to be in charge of anything. And the TPP voters hoped that neither party would have a majority, and they were successful in that. They gave their people a mandate to to be anti both the blue and green, which are both trash in their slogan. They were not given a mandate to be a rubber stamp for the KMT. If they wanted to have more KMT votes, they could have just voted for the KMT, but they chose not to. So the purpose of electing such a divided legislature is precisely to prevent any radical shifts or moves in any direction. And for Taiwan, this is not theoretical. It's not that they didn't know what would happen in a divided government. We had 8 years of divided government during the Chen administration. And the KMT blocked a whole raft of DPP initiatives, and people were frustrated about that. But there was no attack on the constitutional order. On the contrary, the two parties eventually managed to put together a major package of constitutional reforms. But now the KMT and TPP alliance have been pushing through a whole series of such controversial measures, several of which, especially the attack on the Constitutional Court, are threats to the constitutional order. And voters certainly did not give them a mandate to do that. And so that is why the Great Recall, as it's known in Taiwan, has so much legitimacy. And it cannot be considered a simple revenge recall, like the one against legislator Chen Bo-wei in 2021. That's an example of misuse of recall. However, at the time, Eric Zhu declared that to be a, quote, victory for democracy. So, or like the many recalls the KMT launched this year. They launched, I don't know how many, 22 against the Legislative Yuan and another, I don't know, 18 or 20 against councilmen. It puts the lie to their argument that this is that recalls are inherently bad. And at the end of the day, the voters in Taiwan, mostly on Saturday and then 4 weeks later with the second mini wave of recalls, the voters are going to make these final decisions, and that is how it should be. So far from being anti-democratic, these recalls represent a deepening and strengthening of Taiwan's democracy. Citizens are more engaged and aware, and they are more empowered and prepared to take action. This can only strengthen Taiwan's political and social resilience. Therefore, although Taiwan's friends in the international community may not take a position in favor of a particular outcome, just as people should do for regular elections, the process of recalls as a whole, I believe, should be broadly welcomed. And that's my remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bo. I really liked what you said about how any democratic mechanism can be misused. And I think that's a really good reminder of how, we try to put these different mechanisms into place to have a government that is fair and just. But of course, it's hard to figure out how they will be used. And so it comes down to how citizens use it, how the governments use it. It's kind of more of a neutral tool that can be used in different ways to exert the will of people. Also, I would like to apologize because I was so excited to hear your remarks that I did not introduce you. So I will do that now. So Bo Teddards is a longtime observer of Taiwan's political scene who recently returned to the USA after living in Taiwan for over 25 years. He is a former staff member of the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, where he served as director of the International Cooperation Department from 2007 to 2010, and again from 2016 to 2022. In his first years in Taiwan, he worked for the Taiwan Association for Human Rights, the Institute for National Policy Research, the Taipei Times, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And also from 2004 to 2010, he served as the coordinator for the World Forum for Democratization in Asia, a regional network of democracy advocates, and from 2013 to 2015 as director of Amnesty International Taiwan. So as you can see, he has a very deep civil society background and a lot of credentials on that side. We also just recently published one of his reports on a background of the recalls, so definitely check that out if you'd like to hear more of Beau's thoughts in a written form. So it's called Taiwan's 2025 Recalls, a Civil Society Perspective. And you can see it on the front page of our website. All right, okay, so thank you so much. We're now going to go to Nathan Batto. So this time I'll do Nathan's introduction. So Dr. Nathan F. Batto is an Associate Research Fellow at the Institute of Political Science, Academia Sinica, and the Election Studies Center, National Juncture University. He holds an MA in Political Science from NCCU and received his PhD from the University of California, San Diego in 2007. His articles have been published in journals including the Journal of Politics, Electoral Studies, and Legislative Studies Quarterly. His recent book, Making Punches Count, The Individual Logic of Legislative Brawls, explores why democratically elected representatives participate in physical violence in legislatures, with a special focus on Taiwan and Ukraine, but also drawing on the experience of many other countries, including South Korea, Japan, Mexico, South Africa, and the United States. It was awarded the 2025 Richard Fenno Prize for the Outstanding Book in Legislative Studies. He is also the author of the blog Frozen Garlic, which provides detailed analysis on political campaigns and elections in Taiwan. And anyone who is interested in domestic politics, I'm sure, is an adamant follower of that blog. So we're definitely lucky to have his comments as well. So please, Nathan, if you would like to make your comments now.
Yeah, well, I'd like to thank the GTI for holding this forum and for inviting me to speak. I will try to answer a couple of the questions that were presented in the I can't talk now. I will try to answer the couple of questions that were asked in the introduction to this event. There were 3 questions. I'm not going to talk about the United States. So the first question is, how did we get here? And there are 2 fundamentally different stories about how we ended up at this moment. The KMT story is that this is a cynical power play. This has always been a cynical power play. The KMT and the TPP won a majority of seats in the election in 2024. They put together a durable coalition. They passed bills in the legislature that they thought were appropriate. They used hardball tactics to pass those bills when necessary, as most majorities do in the face of minority intransigence in democracies around the world. This is normal democratic politics. In their story, the DPP couldn't stand losing in the legislature and tried to figure out some way to undo the result of the 2024 election. So at first they tried to recreate the 2014 Sunflower Movement by inspiring a huge wave of protests in the street. And then those protesters morphed into recalls. But those were always about partisan conflict. And they were always behind them, the hidden hand was always the DPP. This complaining about democratic institutions and mudslinging about China's influence, that's insincere and cynical. It's mere window dressing. It's always been about raw political power. So this whole process has been driven by DPP leaders, DPP extremists, and DPP activists in society. That's one story. The other story is one told by the recall movements. And in that story, you have social movements leading the party. The party in this case would be the DPP. So this whole thing started a year ago in May 2024, when the KMT tried to push through an expansion of legislative powers that was ultimately ruled unconstitutional through various hardball tactics, again, degrading the democratic institutions. And it inspired many concerned citizens to go out into the streets of their own accord. The DPP had very little to do with it. The citizens started to organize recall campaigns, again, of their own accord. The DPP only got involved in January of this year, when several of the recall campaigns were already well underway, and the DPP had to jump in and get on board or risk losing leadership of its side of the political spectrum. So this is a case of the social activists and the social movements doing almost all of the heavy lifting, and the DPP kind of doing a bit of coordinating, a bit of funding, but really not in the lead role. And the social activists, the social movements will tell you they are not the DPP. They don't represent the DPP, and they've built a coalition that is not the DPP coalition. They've built a coalition they think that you will not see in a general election, that includes many people who have in the past been KMT sympathizers, but think that the KMT has gone too far. So those are two very different stories about how we got to where we are. The second question was, what are the issues at stake? And for that, I'm going to ask it in a slightly different way. I'm going to ask, what will the takeaway messages from this recall be? On Saturday night and Sunday morning, what are people going to think are the main lessons of this experience? And that depends almost entirely on the outcomes of the recalls. So if the recalls fizzle out, and by that I mean if 3 or fewer people are recalled, it will be seen as a DPP power play that just didn't work. People will say, well, that's not surprising. The blue and white coalition has an overwhelming popular mandate. They won 60% of the presidential vote and nearly 57% of the party list vote in 2024. And these were all blue districts. We should have known that this was never going to work for the DPP. And all that screaming about democracy and processes and Chinese pressure, that didn't resonate with voters. Voters are tired of hearing about how the KMT is too close to China. We'll also hear some people say that the concrete policies that the KMT has been proposing really worked. So this idea of a universal $10,000 NT subsidy, what's the word, stipend, really made a difference. Voters are happy with things like the budget reallocation from the national government to local governments. We'll hear arguments like that. We'll hear that the various mayors, the party chair, the legislative caucus leaders will claim victory and say that they were responsible for this wonderful victory over DPP overreach. And some people will claim this a no confidence vote in President Lai. If, on the other hand, the recalls are wildly successful, and by that I think I think about 15 or more would succeed. If we get something like that, there will be debates about why they were so successful. And people will say, well, it's not surprising. The KMT was a 33% party in the last election. And it's even less popular now, according to, months of things that I'm not supposed to talk about. According to, we're in the polling blackout, so I can't talk about polls. But it's not surprising because the KMT is not a popular party. And they will ask questions about whether the KMT has been too close to China, whether this was brought on by, passions about procedural justice and degradation of democratic institutions. There will be people who argue that it was bad leadership from the KMT leaders, especially the legislative floor leader Fu Quinqi and the party chair Eric Zhu, who have arguably made lots and lots of bad decisions in the last year. There will also be people who blame this on the TPP and say it was a failure to turn out voters, especially TPP voters, because they didn't think they had a dog in the game. They didn't have any skin in the game. So there will be people who think that it was just a failure to turn out voters. And by the way, there is a typhoon kind of scraping by northern Taiwan this weekend. It's supposed to rain heavily tomorrow and Friday, not so much on Saturday, but they could blame the weather for a failure to turn out voters. They might also say that there might also be people that claim that this overwhelmingly, wildly successful recall was due to the broad-based social movements that attracted a big, wide coalition of supporters, including former KMT sympathizers. So those are some of the things that people might say. If the results are mixed, so we don't have the recalls fizzle out or succeed wildly, if we get a more mixed result, and by that I think about 5 to 10 people are recalled, we'll have different arguments about what this means, depending on who those 5 to 10 people are. It could be that people will try to tell stories that it's all about local politics, and each place had a different soap opera, and there were places where ambitious KMT politicians engaged in backstabbing because they wanted to run in the by-election. And that might be true in some places. There will be people who say this was all about partisanship. And if it's the more competitive districts where people lose, they'll say, well, of course, that's where they lost. This was always about KMT versus DPP, and the partisan balance has shifted just a little bit and moved those districts from slightly blue to slightly green. On the other hand, if we have a different set of people lose, the really controversial legislators, the party floor leaders, people like Wang Hongwei or Xu Xiaoxin, or Fu Quinqi, of course, or Luo Zhiqiang, or people like that, Hu Mengkai, who are more controversial and more aggressive, then people will say, well, it was always about individual legislative performance. And those people were singled out by their voters as breaking some of the conventional norms of behavior in the legislature and in politics in general. There will also be people, depending on who loses, who just say, well, those were lousy politicians. They weren't particularly talented or gifted speakers, and they didn't do anything. They were just bad. And that's one of the classic arguments in democratic politics. When you lose, yeah, we had good ideas, but the other side had better candidates. And so you just blame your politicians for being bad politicians. So those are some of the various things at stake here. What the lesson learned from this recall will depend heavily on how things turn out. Personally, I've learned a few things from the recall that I want to bring up. One of the things that I've learned is that you can't collect 20 or 30,000 signatures without an army of passionate volunteers. You just cannot order it to be done. Neither major party can just write a memo saying, go out and collect signatures. It takes so much grunt work, so much energy, so many people to give up their lives for 6 hours a day for weeks and weeks or months. And you just cannot do that without a big army of volunteers. Or a different way of saying that is the old KMT party machine that we used to think of in the 80s and 90s, that doesn't exist at all anymore. In the past, the KMT would have written a memo and they would have gone out through their network of neighborhood chiefs and they would have had this be done. Nobody has that kind of network anymore. A second thing that I've learned, or I think I've learned, is that recalls are now in the bloodstream. They are now part of Taiwan's political environment. This probably will not be the last recall drive, especially if it's even moderately successful. You can't do a recall just on a moment's notice or just because somebody wants it done. But if it's shown that these are extremely powerful processes, and the payoff is so enormous, we will probably see them happen again when conditions line up the way they have this year. My hope is that the lesson learned is the one that Bo was talking about. The takeaway will be that voters and politicians learn that bad behavior in the legislature is punished, not rewarded. I just wrote a book about legislative brawls, and voters in Taiwan learned a few decades ago in very dramatic fashion that bad behavior in the legislature is rewarded. That fighting, brawling, those people win elections. The numbers show it's actually a pretty moderate effect, but there were dramatic examples of people who engaged in bad behavior in the legislature who did quite well in their electoral careers. And this could be the opportunity for voters to send a signal saying, actually, we don't like that. We don't approve of that. And we will punish bad behavior when we have a chance to. And hopefully this could change the political culture within the legislature and within politics in general. And I will stop here and turn it over to Shelley.
Thank you so much, Nathan. I really like that you laid out all the different possibilities of which way the recalls are going to go and how people are going to respond. I think a lot of the excuses that you brought up are things that we've also heard in other countries in other contexts. So it's kind of interesting to hear about how there's a lot of similarities between the ways that voters will respond in different contexts as well. So yeah, thank you so much. We're now going to go to Shelley for her remarks. So Dr. Shelley Rigger is the Vice President for Academic Affairs, Dean of Faculty, and Brown Professor of East Asian Politics at Davidson College. She has a PhD in Government from Harvard University and a BA in Public and International Affairs from Princeton University. She is a non-resident fellow of the China Policy Institute at Nottingham University and a senior fellow of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. She is also a director of the Taiwan Fund, a closed-end investment fund specializing in Taiwan-listed companies. Dr. Rigger is the author of 2 books on Taiwan's domestic politics, Politics in Taiwan, Voting for Democracy, and From Opposition to Power, Taiwan's Democratic Progressive Party. Her most recent book, The Tiger Leading the Dragon, How Taiwan Propelled China's Economic Rise, explains how Taiwanese businesses made it possible for the PRC, a country without private property or business as recently as 1978, became the factory to the world. So Shelley, please take it away with your remarks.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here with you, Adrian, and also with Bo and Nathan. Just to clarify a point that Nathan kind of made briefly there, he actually really is not allowed to talk about polls on this call because it's illegal to discuss polling data in the immediate days before an election. So I'm sure many of the questioners are dying to know what the polling is saying, but you'll have to ask Bo because Nathan can't tell you. And I don't know, Nathan, if you can get in trouble for what Bo and I say on the call, like blink twice, okay? So yeah, I just want to say a couple of quick things and then get on to discussion because this is such a rich topic, but it's not one that I have not been following this nearly as closely as the other 2 participants. But you know, a question that the recalls raise, and I think it is a fair question. I mean, I think we do need to kind of grapple with how democratic is an institution like recall, especially when it's set up the way Taiwan's recall elections are, such that it is in some ways easier to get recalled than it is to get elected in the first place. So the balance of votes required means that you can win comfortably and then be recalled with fewer votes than were required for you to win. So it's a pretty easy way to overturn the result of an election, which means that it has the potential, at least, to introduce a pretty high degree of instability. Like if Nathan's right and it's in the bloodstream, and every time people don't like the result of an election, they attempt a recall, that's preferable to overrunning the national capital and, beating up the police and invading the legislature with violence. But it's not ideal, obviously, for normal democratic functioning. But I think where Nathan makes another good point is it's not as easy as it looks, right? I think there was a perception prior to this round of recalls that recalls were easy. And you just had to get a few signatures, put people on the ballot, mobilize some votes, and boom, you could get rid of somebody. Ironically, the scale of this set of recalls has, while it has been on the anti-KMT side successful, it has also demonstrated how hard it is to mobilize that army of passionate volunteers, because the KMT attempted to counter recall and every one of their attempts fell flat, fell short, and what it fell short of was the social mobilization that's required. So I think it's kind of a mixed result in terms of, what are we learning about recall. It's scary to think that any politician could face a recall at any moment. And also that's probably not going to happen because of the difficulty of actually using the tool. But it is a powerful tool and one that could be a little bit or substantially destabilizing. And I think where this comes from is no set of democratic institutions is ever perfect or functions in the way that its founders or creators intended in all situations. And certainly we're learning that in the US too, right? That a constitution is only as good as the willingness of public officials, especially elected officials, but also appointed judicial officials, to actually uphold that constitution. But Taiwan's constitution is particularly fraught with problematic elements, features of the Constitution that were not fully resolved or managed in the democratization process. And that's partially a result of the just absolute refusal of the PRC to ever permit Taiwan to do a thorough constitutional overhaul. So Taiwan's constitution is this kind of amended thing that's very old. And so, you know, places where you might have said, let's just take that, let's just start over. Taiwan has not been able to start over. But it's also a consequence of decisions that leaders made, especially leaders during the Li Denghui era, to create institutions that worked for them then, but that would not have been what a constitutional scholar would have created. So, for example, divided government works poorly in Taiwan, as Bo described. It works poorly because many of the mechanisms that allow divided government not to be totally paralyzing in other presidential states don't exist in Taiwan. And the one that they have, one that Bo didn't mention, is that the legislature, if it doesn't like the president's choice of a domestic policy lead, that is the premier, they can dissolve the legislature, fire the premier, and hold new elections. So they have this kind of parliamentary power to dissolve the legislature through a vote of no confidence, but they don't have the ability to replace the president. They only have the ability to replace the premier. And what we have found in Taiwan is that during periods of divided government, the legislators are unwilling to give up their own secure position in order to use the leverage that they do have to force the president to find a premier who is more acceptable and will pursue compromise with the legislature, because they don't get what they really want, which is to get rid of the president, but they lose their jobs in the process. So there are mechanisms that are supposed to work to mitigate the effects of divided government, but they have not worked very well. And I agree. So while I guess I'm defending the KMT's position a little bit, that some of the features of Taiwan's democracy that are front and center in this moment because of the recall, I also entirely agree that the KMT has made a series of unfortunate decisions, unfortunate for its own success in pursuing its own objectives. And probably the most basic one is that when the new legislature was seated, the KMT very quickly began pursuing all of these measures designed to restrict the powers of the executive branch and to expand the power of the legislature. The one thing they didn't do is the one thing that, you know, if Nathan had been hired as a consultant to tell them how to maximize their security in their position in the legislature, I probably very high on his list would have been amend the recall legislation to make it harder to recall legislators. And they just didn't. They did not prioritize. They did not anticipate that this mechanism could be used against them. So now it's being used against them, and it's too late to change the mechanism itself. So just briefly, you know, what is the significance of the recall for things like cross-strait relations, U.S.-China relations, U.S.-Taiwan relations? One sentence on that. And that is well, it's going to be like a series of sentences, but it's really just one point. The PRC is, of course, horrified by the recalls. They are ostensibly horrified on behalf of Taiwan's democracy, which I think most people on this call would agree is just kind of cynical. And I just don't think that PRC officials have much of a leg to stand on to criticize someone else's democratic functioning. But I think they are concerned genuinely that the outcome of the recalls, regardless of which version of, whether it's the small, medium, or large version that Nathan has described, that the three mechanisms that Beau's talking about that all pull the legislature away from the direction the KMT was going originally, these are all antithetical to the preferences of the Beijing government. So they don't like the recalls, and they're worried about the outcome. And they will say that the outcome, unless it is overwhelmingly, well, fizzling out, they will declare victory. If the recalls fizzle out, Beijing will say, you see, we told you, Taiwanese people don't want this Taiwan independence agenda that Lai Ching-te is selling in their construction of it. Any other outcome, and they will say, the independence forces have somehow managed to engineer, against the will of the Taiwanese people, an outcome that puts us all in greater danger. Unfortunately, I think whatever Taiwan does, Beijing finds a way to construct it in that same way, as an excuse for further military and political pressure. So in my view, Americans should not be so worried about what Taiwan does with its own democracy, but should be more concerned about what Americans are doing with our own democracy, first of all, and then also how we're managing our relations with the PRC, which is a topic for another day. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Shelley. Yeah, thank you for talking about some of the other mechanisms, like, for example, dissolution of the legislature. I think that's very interesting to hear that it's not really used at all. And yeah, very interesting to also hear a little bit about how Beijing would see these recalls and what kind of narratives they will bring out of it. So we'll go into the Q&A period now. So please, all of our viewers, if you would like to send your questions in the YouTube chat, you can also tweet us. You can also send it to contact@globaltaiwan.org. I have a little thing right here, which you can also read about how you can send in your questions. So looking forward to getting lots of questions. I'll just start off with one question as the moderator's prerogative. But I was wondering, how likely is it, do you think, that the KMT and the DPP and the TPP will change their strategy and reform based on the recalls? So, of course, there's been a lot of unwillingness, for example, for the KMT to kind of shift away from certain extremist points of view within the KMT. Of course, Lai is sort of characterized as independent Taiwan sort of policy. So how likely is it, do you think, that these different political parties shift away from these sort of more extreme sides of their party based on the recalls?
Do either one of you want to try to answer that?
Everybody's being very quiet. I'll jump in, even though nobody wants to. I don't want to either. Basically, in a nutshell, I doubt the DPP is going to make any strategic changes, because more or less the recalls are pushing in their direction. They may on the margins feel they have to work a little bit more closely with some of these civil society groups, to keep them on side, so to speak. But I think that's more or less on the margins. The KMT, I mean, yeah, maybe. It depends. Like I said, it depends on what happens to the composition of their caucus. If in that scenario that Nathan mentioned, that the ones that drop, the more likely to drop, turn out to be the more extreme ones, then I think there would be a push for attacking to the center. I think that's a reasonable possibility, but I don't know how likely it is. I think that the more curious and difficult one is the position of the TPP, because they're really sort of neither fish nor fowl in this fight. They can be blamed for a KMT loss, or they can take advantage of a KMT loss. And I think it's very curious to see whether they continue with this really surprisingly rock solid coalition with the KMT. I was surprised. I expected them to be more transactional, like we'll support you on this issue, but we won't on this other issue. And they really haven't been doing that under the leadership of Huang Guotang. And a recall would be a repudiation of him. The slogan in Taiwan is a vote to recall anybody, whichever 31 person you're talking about, is a vote to recall Fu Kunqi and a vote to punish Huang Guotang. So that's the general slogan out there. So I'm very curious how Huang Guotang, I mean, he personally probably won't change, but will the party make moves to shift him around and try to get a new strategy? That's a very big question mark.
Let me add, I also expected the TPP to be more transactional early on, but that coalition has been cemented by the investigation into Kuomintang's corruption, and they blame that entirely on the TPP, and so they have been really kind of pushed into a very strong coalition with the KMT. And if you look at the identities of the people in the TPP, they mostly come out of the blue side and some of the deep blue sides. So personally, most of the people in the TPP, the elites, not necessarily the voters, but the elites, and especially the ones in the legislature, are quite comfortable in a coalition with the KMT. The KMT is interestingly ripe for a reshuffle. Their party chair is going to be reelected. Eric Zhu's term ends in October, so they're pushing the election back as far as they can, but probably sometime in September, right after all of this recall is done. And so there will be a lot of recrimination if the recalls are anywhere successful. And, you know, they will be looking to blame somebody, and also to be able to say, we made some mistakes, and it's not our ideas that are a problem, it's our tactics and our leadership that's the problem. So you can easily see Wu and Zhu becoming the scapegoats and moving the party in a different direction, not necessarily abandoning any of their ideals, but saying it was bad leadership that led to bad tactics and bad decisions and bad outcomes.
Well, thank you
And-
for oh, Shelley, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I would just add that many of the KMT's ideas, like definitely some of their high level slogans or talking points are problematic, but you know, right now the KMT actually stands for very little that's all that much different from mainstream public opinion in Taiwan, but they have been prevented from developing and vocalizing they are unable to find a new way to talk about things because of the hierarchical, oppressive, and geriatric nature of the not necessarily the formal leadership of the party, but definitely the actual leadership of the party. And the thing is that I would love to believe that this will be the moment to break through that and give the KMT the new lease on life that Taiwan's democracy desperately needs, because the KMT is the leading opposition party in Taiwan. And that is a requirement. A functional, loyal opposition is a requirement for democratic politics. The KMT has been through so many of these crisis moments, though, where we said, okay, this has got to be it. Like this time, they're going to actually reform. That unfortunately, I have no confidence to predict that this will be the one.
Yeah, thanks, Shelley. I think you do bring up a really good point. I mean, obviously, we're all very concerned about the national security of Taiwan as well. And actually, we just got 2 questions from our audience that do relate to that as well. So we have a question from Caitlin Campbell from the Congressional Research Service. She was asking, one imagines, particularly if the KMT is perceived to have won the recall, there will be questions about the role of malign PRC influence in the recall campaigns and votes. Have you seen evidence of PRC interference in the recalls? How robust is election security for recalls in Taiwan? Is this something you're concerned about? And we also got a question from our YouTube chat that also asks about CCP intervention or provocative actions ahead of the Great Recall.
No one's jumping in.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Ben. Bo.
Yeah, no, I mean, just to assuage the questioner's, one of the questioner's concerns, the election processes, the voting and counting and everything is very robust in Taiwan, and I would think almost impossible to manipulate. So I wouldn't worry about that. Certainly, the PRC's disinformation machine is running at full speed now to try to promote these anti-recall narratives, as they always do. So I don't have any specific thoughts on that. And I don't know if either Nathan or Shelley has got any observations about that.
I was going to say the same thing about the robustness of the vote counting. I really haven't noticed the PRC influence, and it's getting a little bit late for them to do something dramatic. When you do something dramatic on the last day, it usually backfires. So I am less and less worried about, a big Chinese military drill or whatever they might do.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from our audience. This one is from Sam Yeboah from Olam Research. He was asking, do you have any idea of what this great recall has cost Taiwan's economy? And whether or not the cost is justified. I've not heard this angle on the recalls before, so I think it'd be interesting to hear if there have been any impacts on the economy. I do know there was some talk about the tariffs impacting the tariff talks between US Taiwan impacting the recalls. So maybe you could also touch on that as well.
So there was a story from the Central Election Commission a few days ago that said how much they're spending on the recalls. And I'm trying to remember the number. It was it was a very large number. Democracy, when it's done well, is not cheap. One of the things that Democratic advisors have said is that you can have, everybody wants their elections to be fast, accurate, and cheap. And you can have 2 out of 3. You can't have all 3. And Taiwan's elections are pretty expensive to run, to administer. I can't remember what the cost was. But what a lot of that money goes to paying workers to work at the polls. So it's not wasted money. It gets recycled back into the economy. You're paying a lot of elementary school teachers for an extra day of work. So the economic impact, I don't know. I don't think it's really harming Taiwan's economy to have an election. And I do remember that the referendum in August will cost about twice as much as these recalls, because that's a national thing, and these recalls will only affect about half the districts in the country. But that's the idea that this is going to harm Taiwan's economy or help Taiwan's economy is not really a very strong talking point.
Adrian, to your point about the tariffs, though, it is interesting to see how the U.S. Has been an issue of discussion, under discussion in this election, as in the most recent national legislative elections in Taiwan, where the KMT position is that the U.S. is an increasingly unreliable partner for Taiwan, and that Taiwan needs to kind of hedge against the possibility of U.S. in other ways damaging Taiwan's interests. And certainly the flexible approach that the Trump administration or the Trump himself have taken toward Taiwan has fed that narrative in many ways. But there is also, the counter to that in Taiwan is that Congress, the U.S. Congress, certain days, the executive branch, the White House, seems to be supporting Taiwan. So the U.S. is kind of all over the place in terms of its policy, which means that it's hard to know which it's hard to know which side has the right idea in Taiwan about where the U.S. is headed. One thing, though, that I don't, this is kind of a side point, but I think the U.S. has often been criticized for interfering in Taiwan's elections. We've talked today about ways that China could interfere, but it is a kind of commonplace in Taiwanese elections for people to say the U.S. took a side and that's why our side lost. And if the U.S. were to announce anything with respect to tariffs on Taiwan between now and Saturday, I think that would not only appear to be, but would be interference in Taiwan's domestic politics, right? If we announced a deal to enact a lower tariff rate, right? The one on that list was 32%, I believe. If we went in for something lower, that would be, the KMT would see that as absolute perfidy, endorsing the DPP. If we went for a higher tariff rate, the DPP would say, you've put your thumb on the scale for the KMT here. I don't think actually American policymakers have any idea that matters, that could happen. But I would really hate to see the U.S. take an action that would be perceived as a kind of intervention in Taiwan's election, and anything to do with tariffs between now and Saturday absolutely would be interpreted that way. Would you agree, Nathan, that that's what people would say?
I agree that that's what people would say. I don't know that it would have that much of an impact, simply because people tend to interpret, especially late breaking news, as confirming their pre-existing stances. There was, you're talking about any kind of announcement. The AIT announced, put out a press release yesterday about a spaceport cooperation between Houston and southern Taiwan, in which travel time from Taiwan to Houston would be reduced to 2.5 hours in suborbital flights. So there you go. Somebody's putting the thumb on the scale, pushing U.S.-Taiwan cooperation. I have no idea what a spaceport means, but it was a fun little bit of the
Yeah,
news.
I don't know anything about the spaceport either. I think Shelley is right, though, that it would be perceived that way, and it would, but I think Nathan's also right. It wouldn't probably affect the results, but it would definitely play into the blame game afterwards. You know, that whatever happens, somebody would blame the US for it. So that's probably best to be avoided.
Yeah, I mean, great points. It's also interesting to think about US interference because we always talk about Chinese interference instead. So interesting to see the shoe on the other foot. So we have another question. I'm not sure how much we can get into this because we can't talk about the polls. But obviously, we're talking about civil society mobilization and collecting all of these signatures. And you were talking about how difficult it is to get volunteers engaged. But also, what does the Taiwanese general public think of the recalls? Is a majority of the society behind it? What do public opinion polls say? So beyond these groups of volunteers, is the greater Taiwanese society also in favor of recalls?
Let me not talk about polls because we are in the polling blackout, and it's illegal for me to talk about polls. Let me talk about the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom is that the pro-recall side is much more heavily energized than the anti-recall side. And that they will turn out probably at a much higher rate than people who are against the recall. And the KMT's task right now is to mobilize people who are apathetic about this whole thing. What else can I say here? Yeah, the passion is all on one side. And in the last couple of weeks, the KMT has put on a series of rallies trying to convince its voters that this matters and they should care and they need to go out and stop it. But they are fighting a different battle than the pro-recall people who are trying to expand their coalition and at various points in the last couple of weeks, I've thought that this is a snowball rolling downhill and out of control. And at other times I've thought, no, the KMT is going to mobilize its people and they'll be able to slow it down. But the conventional wisdom is that the KMT needs a heavy turnout of people who are not necessarily motivated to care one way or another. And I think I didn't break the law.
Bo, Shelley, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I don't have much polling data. I cited one article in my backgrounder, but that was just the one I happened to find. I'm not really sure I believe it exactly. I just wanted to give an example. It was from Yo Inglong's group, and this is before the polling blackout. But they put out some numbers and stuff, but they seemed a little bit strange to me. But I think Nathan, if I got you point correctly, that the probably high turnout benefits the KMT. If a very high turnout. If it's a medium high turnout, it's hard to say because it could be an exceptionally high turnout on the pro recall side, balancing off a mediocre turnout on the KMT side. Does that sound about right? Best we can tell. Could be different in every district too. That's the other thing. There are a lot of local factors at play here that people, it's a bit too much in the weeds for a, international seminar on the thing, but but there are a ton of local factors in these districts playing out.
Yeah, there are interesting soap operas in every district. And again, that could be one of the explanations or rationalizations for whatever happens, is that for whatever reason, this legislator was able to turn out, especially the old TPP voters, who don't have a clear reason to turn out because Cohen's is not on the ballot and no TPP people are on the ballot. And the people who voted for Cohen's are not necessarily dedicated, loyal TPP supporters anyway. So we don't really know.
The original question was about the kind of popularity of recall as a mechanism, though, right, Adrian?
Yeah, yeah. Or,
And-
oh, recalls are, I guess, maybe recalls as a mechanism, and then
Yeah.
also these specifically.
So Nathan is right that recall is in the bloodstream. It's a thing that people think of when they want things to change. But I think we always need to be mindful of the fact that there is a very large sort of silent middle in Taiwan that just would like for things to calm down. Taiwanese voters are very oriented toward their economic interests. The political parties do not vary much in terms of their pro-business, their developmentalist economic agendas. Nobody seems to be falling over themselves to support labor or, vastly improve the conditions for migrant workers in Taiwan and so on. And that they are catering to the electorate when they take those sort of what we would think of as economically more conservative positions. So I think it's, I don't know the proportion of people, but it would not surprise me if there were a substantial majority that sort of said, I am tired of all this. I need this to calm down. I don't want to see another election for a long time. And we in the US tend to see and speak with and hear from people in Taiwan who are just total political nerds, and all they care about is politics, and they just want it to keep happening. But that's not the majority. Most people, I think, are worried about the instability in across all dimensions. So, I think the question of whether or not recall is a mechanism that is viewed favorably, whether it is or is not. Political instability is not. And this is a moment of political instability. And so not like something that most people are excited about, although those armies of passionate volunteers are very excited, and the social movements definitely feel their power in this moment in a very positive way. And, they're the ones that we're going to hear from the most.
Yeah, thanks, Shelley. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, I think, for a majority of people.
Yeah, I agree with what Shelley said. I think the voter fatigue is real, and voters are not interested in having another campaign again. They're tired of campaigns. They like the campaign season to be over and done with, which is one of the sort of natural barriers to recalls, right? On the one hand, you have to actually do the work of collecting the signatures, which Nathan described as such a big barrier. But if the voters don't see a compelling reason, they're just going to tell you to go away. They're going to say, can't you just go away? We have an election already next time. I'll vote then. I don't want to deal with it now. And so I think this is a unique situation, confluence of factors in Taiwan that has brought so many people to want to have recalls now, because normally they wouldn't. And so I think in terms of just the future, in terms of the idea that you can just rerun every election over and over again, that won't happen because the voters will reject that idea and they will turn on people who are actively promoting it. So I think the KMT has done themselves a big disservice by trying to gin up, 30 or 40 recalls all around the country, because people are just like, no, we're not interested in your recalls, and they just fizzled completely. They didn't have a story, they didn't have a reason. So what? So some DBP guy is in office. Well, whatever, maybe I'll vote for somebody else in 4 years. They couldn't even get their own base, to sign the petitions. So whereas the other one, so I think it's not going to happen all the time. So I think voters will get tired of it really fast, and that'll be a natural check on the instability, because voters don't like instability.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, definitely makes a lot of sense. Of course, the majority of people are just going about their lives and, they might not care about politics all the time. They're just trying to, go to their job every day, survive. So it definitely makes sense. I think we can definitely see that sort of fatigue in other countries as well. But yeah, thank you so much for such a nuanced conversation about the recalls, since we're already at time. I think I'll end our event here. But I definitely learned a lot during this event, and I hope that all of our viewers also learned so much. And thank you so much for all of your time.
Well, thank you, Adrian, and thank everyone. Thank Nathan and Shelley.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
all
you.
our viewers.
Yeah, thanks for holding this event, and it was very interesting.
Yeah, and thanks for joining in the middle of the night there, Nathan.
Yay.
We're